If I want to put the difference between myself and the government on this, I'd say this. They say if you have a mayoral system, if you have a mayor, you can have more powers. I say if you believe in more powers for local government, you shouldn't just have to have a mayor to have those powers, you should have those powers over economic development, over transport, over skills. And I think that part of the challenge for our country is rebuilding faith in politics. You can't rebuild faith in politics if people say, I'm really worried about the local bus service. I don't know what the bus services are like in Lincoln, but where I represent in Doncaster, they're not very good. What frustrates me, I can't go to my local councillor and say, do something about the bus services, because they'll say, it's not my job, it's the Passenger Transport Authority. I'll then go to them and they'll say, well, it's not my job, it's somebody else's job. You know, people should actually we should ensure that decisions that affect people's lives are made by people accountable to them. And that's where local government is, in my view, important. So what do I need to do? And what am I determined to do? I'm determined to show that we can rebuild this country. I think that's, you know, I use that phrase advisedly. After 1945, we talked about rebuilding the country. I think the financial crisis and what happened is so great. The problems in our country, and the gentleman that talked about them in relation to the elderly, are so significant. It's nothing less than rebuilding our country, rebuilding our economy, so it works for working people, not just a few people at the top. And by the way, you know, if you want to see what I mean by that, just look at this banking business and Barclays. I mean, can you believe it? What a contrast with our armed forces. You know, our armed forces who serve, who have the right values, who do the right thing, and what a contrast to what is happening in the banks. You know, people at Barclays taking what they can, ripping off the system, you know, not a victimless crime, but something that is actually affecting people up and down this country. So you've got to rebuild your economy, you've got to rebuild your society, and I'm going to come to talk about the elderly, and you've got to do something else, which is rebuild faith in politics. We have people from different backgrounds in politics, people like Dan, but also we do something, and this is why I gave the answer I did to Simon, we underpromise and overdeliver, not overpromise and underdeliver. Because how often do politicians overpromise and say, yeah, I can do, you know, give you the earth. In opposition, I can give you the earth. In government, oh, it's all rather more difficult than I thought. But so I think we've got to rebuild faith in politics. They have to be held to account for their actions. That's what I think gets people about this banking thing. Nobody's gone to jail. Nobody's been prosecuted. Nobody seems to be paying the price. And they think, well, hang on a minute. You know, if I went and shoplifted the local Tesco's and stole £10 worth of goods, I'll be straight to the court and possibly in jail. And you know, how can these people be making off with millions of pounds and paying no consequences? I mean, there's just a phrase for that, double standards. And that's what we've got to do. And we've got to make sure that the full force of the law is brought against people who do the wrong thing. And that should be a basic principle in my view. Young people are getting a terrible deal at the moment. And frankly, I think we can inspire young people. Now, what would I do? If I was Prime Minister tomorrow, what's the first thing I would be doing? Literally the first thing I would be doing, it would be saying, let's get our young people back to work. You've got long-term youth unemployment, the number of young people out of work more than a year, which has more than doubled over the last 12 months, more than doubled. It's just shooting up. And, you know, it's not that difficult to create jobs for young people. I would mobilise every employer in the country. I'd mobilise every member of civil society, and I'd say, right, government's going to pay the wages, you're going to provide the training, and let's get our young people working again. For X or I vote for Y, actually, whoever's in power, my living standards are going to be squeezed because they can't control things. They can't really make a difference. And you hear that a lot at the moment, people saying, look, whoever's in office, it's just going to all be the same. I think we can change that, but I think we've got to show people that we can change that. Show, you know, take on the energy companies to actually do something about people's bills. That's part of them. Take on the train companies who are ripping people off year after year. So I think it's about showing people you can make a difference to their standard of living, and that, you know, there is a difference. We wouldn't be cutting the 50p tax rate for millionaires. We'd actually be helping working people, and that is a big difference between us and, I believe, the government that's in power.
Nothing sadder in the streets of Lincoln or anywhere else than to see ex-servicemen holding out their hands for money. We've had several charities which are old and distinguished, such as Royal British Legion, SAFA, and now Help for Heroes. Help for Heroes are building infrastructure that I and everybody else, I'm sure, here, believes is firmly the remit of the government.
Yeah.
We have been secondary taxed to provide the facilities to take care of our brave young men.
To give you an example, I left the service, I was given A1 hearing. Within 6 months I was having major problems. I had to get 3 independent hearing tests to prove that my hearing was damaged and had been damaged in the forces. They all gave me a deficit of 27 to 29%. The Ministry of Defence sent somebody to my house to give me an independent hearing test. When I received a letter from them, they said yes, they would accept the fact that my hearing was damaged to the fact of 9%. And they offered me, which I accepted, a very measly sum, which would not even buy me a set of hearing aids. I also got a letter to say that within the next 5 years, if it deteriorated, I would reapply. My hearing is now down to about 66% loss. I've got 2 hearing aids. It's cost me 4,000 quid on my own pocket to be able to come here today and listen to you people. I have applied to the Admiralty, through the Ministry of Defence obviously, on numerous occasions, asking for my case to be reopened. And every time I get the same answer, sorry, the door is closed on hearing. We've had this with asbestos. The door was closed on asbestos. It is virtually closed now. There is just a small chink there. But every matlow that's been on board ship has been subject to asbestos, although the governments do not accept this. What can you do, and what can future governments do to redress this matter with not only hearing, not only asbestos, but many, many other problems that servicemen are leaving these services with and are not getting any possible benefit or help from it at all? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to do the politician's thing of denying what you're saying, because you're clearly right. What we've now got to do is fulfil the military covenant, not just in the letter of the law, but actually in the spirit of the law, and actually make it happen. And that's why I said at the beginning, I think there are huge challenges in relation to, for example, employment, when people leave the forces. And the American GI Bill is the sort of most famous example of what was actually done for people leaving the forces. I think we've got to think as radically as that about how we do the things that you're talking about. Of course, I think all of us would applaud the generosity of the British people through Help for Heroes, the Legion and other things, but you're right to say that that can't be the core of the service. The core of the service should be provided by government, and the duty should be about what government does. And as part of our process, we're in opposition, we're learning, it's one of the reasons to be here today, we're trying to look through each and every aspect of that military covenant to say, well, how can we make good on it when they leave the forces? And again, you've got my commitment to try, I'm not going to make a false promise, but to try and do everything we can to make good on that. On the question that Chris asked, was a really interesting question. So the government has reduced the level of the armed forces. I think that if we were in government, I'm not going to pretend that we wouldn't be able to make some similarly tough decisions. I think there's 2 issues I have about the government. I'll come to your point about Trident in a sec. First of all, I don't think that they managed to do the strategic look at what we actually needed as a British armed forces for the future. They did a very, very quick study, their Strategic Defence and Security Review, which didn't really say, what are the big threats to Britain, what kind of role do we want to play in the world, and then let's make the conclusions. And I think it became a bit of a sort of salami slicing exercise, and I think actually that wasn't the right way to approach it. As a party, we're looking at the issue of nuclear deterrent. I'm for an independent nuclear deterrent, but I'm for the most minimum deterrent you can have because of cost. And I think that's the right way to think about this. I think the world is sufficiently dangerous that for us to say we're going to unilaterally abandon our deterrent wouldn't be the right thing to do. There'll be people who disagree with that position. But let's make sure that when we have that deterrent, it doesn't overwhelm all the other things that we need to do as a country, including the investment in our armed forces. The aircraft carriers thing has been a bit of a mess, frankly, in the way the government has gone about it. So I think you're asking totally the right questions, and I think that's why we need strategically to plan for what kind of armed forces do we need as a country, and then let's make the financial decisions, not the other way around, which I think is slightly the way that they've approached it.
Just pick up very quickly on Mike's point about servicemen on the streets, because I think that's really important as well. I mean, I think there are fewer service people on the streets than there were perhaps a generation ago, but we should never be complacent about that. I think the Army, the Navy, the Air Force have got better at making sure people move into civilian street, and by and large, most people get the help and support that they need. But one of the greatest problems, and one of the main reasons why people are under London Bridge or on the streets of Lincoln, is because they've got mental health problems. Now, it's an often quoted fact, and Ed referred to it earlier on, that if you look back to the Falklands campaign of 1982, I have to say I don't know whether this is true, but people often say that more people committed suicide after the Falklands campaign in 1982 than were actually killed during the fighting. Now, as a society, as politicians, we need to recognise that the intensity of the fight in Afghanistan is no less intense than it was in the Falklands 30 years ago. And therefore, the reality is that today, tomorrow, next week, next year, in 10 years' time, there will be people who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq who will be presenting with mental health problems. And I think you mentioned what happens in America. I think the Americans do things on a bigger scale. But I think we have a responsibility to understand, linking very neatly to your point, that if people have been affected by their service, either psychologically or through physical injury, government of whatever colour, I think, has a duty and obligation to look after them. You raise a very important point about the role of reservists, and I'm constantly impressed at people who manage to balance those competing commitments in their life, busy jobs, commitments with their family, and when in fact most people want to just put their feet up at the weekend, our reservists don't put their feet up at the weekend, they put the uniforms on and they go out and train. And I've seen people on operations from the reserve forces doing the most incredible things. And I think that they provide an incredibly valuable component within our armed forces. I think just tracking back to the point that I made earlier about the Strategic Defence Review, that was the opportunity to look very carefully at the way in which we integrate the reserve forces into our regular armed forces. Now, the government have made a number of judgments and decisions about that, which frankly involves a considerable amount of risk. And essentially the direction of travel is to place ever increasing more reliance on the reserves. Now, I would kind of understand that if it was, frankly, I'm afraid, not about doing it on the cheap. So what I think is that they do provide a very valuable contribution, but when you're making those incredibly big, important strategic judgments, you should make them about what's right for the armed forces, not about just using mechanisms in which you can save money.
Get away with it. Secondly, you've got to regulate properly. One of the things people don't know, I think, about this current business around this particular market that's being exploited, it's not really properly regulated. It's regulated by the British Bankers Association, i.e. it's the bankers regulating the bankers. Well, that is not a great idea, really, because that's not going to stop people behaving badly. Thirdly, I think there's got to be a much wider look at why we had these problems in the banking system. Because the banking system should really be about serving the real economy. The small businesses of this country, the small businesses of Lincoln, that really need help. And I'm afraid it became an industry that just only interested in itself, in looking inwards, not saying how do we serve the rest of the economy. We'll all share around respecting our armed forces. That's why it's good that we have Armed Forces Day and events like this to remind us of the importance of that. Secondly, just on politics, I think that the real danger our country faces is that people give up on politics and give up on the idea that politics can make a difference. I had the privilege to be in the House of Commons last week when Aung San Suu Kyi, the lady who was under house arrest in Burma for 15 years, who's been fighting that regime for decades, came to Westminster to talk to members of Parliament. And this is somebody who's still fighting to try and get the vote for people in Burma. And then she comes to this country, and I think you can see her sort of slightly thinking, you're kind of taking this for granted here. You're taking for granted that you can vote, you can get rid of one government and have another government come in. You know, she's just managed to fight a by-election, but they don't have full democracy in Burma yet, and she's not sure she's going to get it. Now, I don't blame people for that, I blame politics. I think politics has to convince people, actually, it can make a difference to your life. To Biff's mates, and people right across Lincoln. I might end by saying that I think in somebody like Lucy, we've got somebody who can show that politics can make a difference, along with the Labour Party members here. So thank you very much for coming. Apologies to those who didn't get a chance to ask questions. But most of all, I'd say whatever political party you support, please remain engaged in politics, because I think politics and democracy needs you. Thank you very much.